بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد. You guys want to test?
No.
Alright, maybe we'll do a test next week on the one ayat we were discussing. Make sure everybody comes next week and we'll do a test. Alright. So today we're going to start a new topic. And we had been discussing what topic we wanted to talk about, and I think we came down to the conclusion we want to start talking about fiqh, Islamic laws. Yes? Yes? Okay. Islam, what is Islam? Huh?
Peace.
Team? Deen. Okay, deen. Alright, Islam is peace. Okay. Islam, let me give you my textbook definition here. Islam is a way of life. Yes? It governs every aspect of your way of life, every aspect of your interactions in your life. Right? We can break Islam down into three main categories. Alright? Three categories. Not writing Arabic, we're writing English. Three categories. Right? Okay. First, philosophy. Two, I guess we could call this one worship. Three,
Freedom.
day-to-day life. Our day-to-day dealings.
Isn't that the same as worship?
Ah, interesting. So the question is day-to-day dealings the same as worship? Now let me ask you something.
You're supposed to worship.
How old are you?
14.
14. You're 14, and your shoes, you need to buy a new pair of sneakers. So you go to, where should we send them? Foot Locker? Okay, we'll send them to Foot Locker. We can send them to Century 21 too. Alright. Alright, let's say Century 21. Huh? Calm down. You go there, and you go and you look for a pair of shoes that you like, you find a pair of shoes, you check the price is good. Now you go and you want to go pay for the shoes. How would we categorize this? Would we categorize this as worship, or would we categorize this as day-to-day dealings? Day-to-day. Let's say you want to rent a house. Not you in particular, but maybe inshallah someday. You want to rent a house. You go to rent a house, and you have to set an agreement with the landlord. What are your requirements, your expectations, how you'll treat the house? Is that worship or day-to-day dealings? Okay, let's take another example. Let's say marriage. Now, some may consider marriage a punishment. Not me. Some may consider marriage a punishment. Some may consider it an act of worship. But really, it's a contract between a man and a woman. More of a day-to-day dealing aspect. Yes? So let me explain what I mean by when I say philosophy, worship, day-to-day dealings. Okay? Philosophy, we would incorporate those fundamental beliefs that are necessary for you to be considered a Muslim. Okay? So, fundamental beliefs. Who can tell me what some of these fundamental beliefs are?
Salah.
Okay, so the first one would be, the first suggestion you have is, a fundamental belief for you to be considered a Muslim is prayer. I disagree with you. I would categorize prayer as in act of worship. Yes? Anybody else want to take a stab?
Allah is one.
Yes, Allah is one. Tawheed. There you go. Now you're on the right track. No calling out. Okay. I've listed the 5 that we typically discuss, which are referred to as usul-e-din. Okay. Now, what we do is we say that the philosophy of Islam is tied to these 5 different aspects, and we refer to them as usul-e-din, which literally translates to as the principles of faith. Okay? Within the 5 principles of faith, really, the important are 3. Anyone who submits to these 3 statements of Tawheed, Nubuwwat, and Qiyamah is called a Muslim. Case closed. You can have a variation of differences in opinion about imamat and of justice, but fundamentally what we say is if one follows the chain of Nubuwwat or prophethood correctly, they come to the conclusion of imamat. Yes?
Is that what Sunnah does?
Hang on, we're getting there. Hold on. Now, it is permissible to have a philosophical difference between 2 individuals and for them to be considered a Muslim. During the time of the Prophet, to be considered a Muslim, he did one of the first things that a religious authority had done, as well as a government had done, and he took a survey. He sent out a survey amongst the people and asked them one question on the survey. Are you a Muslim? And people either answered yes, or people answered no. The question was not put to these people from the Prophet himself. Do you accept my prophethood? No. He didn't ask them that. Did he ask them? Did he go and check? Do they pray? No. Did he check how they pray? No. Did he make sure that they pay their zakat and khums? No. He asked a simple question. Are you a Muslim or are you not? Why? Because sometimes it finds out that we don't manifest through acts of worship, or maybe even in our day-to-day dealings, the practical aspects of Islam. However, someone enters the tenet of Islam if they accept the philosophy. How do I know somebody accepted the philosophy? Can I cut them open and look at them? I mean, we could try, but I don't think any government or any judge or jury will acquit you of that crime. I think you'll be held responsible for that. You can't. In terms of philosophy, this is why it's very basic when it comes to philosophy. Very basic, very straightforward. You either accept that there is one God, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad was his prophet, and that you'll be held accountable for your day on a day of deeds. You cannot accept someone's opinion about this matter to say that if I tell you God is one, you say, okay, God's one. This is a philosophy. This is your personal internal side. You have to come to the conclusion that you agree with these terminologies or terms or ideas. Okay? This is philosophy, part 1. Part 2, worship. You want to give me an example of worship now? Prayer, okay. Typically we break out prayer into what we call furu', which are typically described as 10 items, which you could call signatures of a Muslim. Or actions that a Muslim is recognized by, right? Which include salat, saum, zakat, khums, hajj, jihad. Saum is fasting, a roza. So prayer, fasting, paying of your taxes, going to hajj, doing jihad, enjoying the good, forbidding the evil, being friends of the family of Rasulullah, being enemies. These are actions. These are physically presentable areas of how to perform certain actions, right? These are usually known as the 10 furu'id-din. Furu'id-din, far, means branches of faith. So while we say philosophy comes in as the fundamentals or principles of belief, principles of faith, we call action of worship or branches of faith, are offshoots. So for example, if we were to see principles as one standing object that has to be accepted, the physical manifestation of these faiths comes in a variety of different formats is what we would say. We would say all these things are offshoots. Because I have this faith, I accept and perform these actions. Yes? Now the third section, to explain what the third section is, we talked about day-to-day dealings. Contracts, we can call them contracts, purchases, business, marriage, wills. Anybody else have any other examples, ideas? Anything else you can think of? Lending money, loans.
Interest.
How about
Job.
you go down the block, or you come into the center, and there's a cell phone sitting there. Does Islam have something to say about that?
Check.
What do you do with that cell phone?
Don't see it.
Or what? You just stick it in your pocket and you say, God's not looking, He didn't say anything, keep going. No, even these aspects, finding something lost. Buying, selling, all these things that people do on a day-to-day basis fit into this third category of day-to-day dealings. Islam discusses all three of these aspects. To the extent where even we talk about going to the bathroom, we have an opinion, we have direction, we have instruction on preferential actions, forbidden actions, things you shouldn't do, things you shouldn't do. Anybody know of something that you well, let me put this question correctly before I give funny answers. Something that is considered prohibited when we talk about going to the bathroom.
Don't take your rings.
Don't take your rings. That could be considered recommended. Prohibited meaning haram.
The toilet seat is like the back is toward the bottom.
Very good. I'm impressed that you knew that. The toilet cannot be facing the front or the back to the direction of Qibla.
What if it's pointing towards like shining light?
See, now here you go. Here you go with your what if questions. You got a lot of what if questions, right? But hang on. The direction is very, very specific. Not you, nor the vessel you empty out into, the porcelain that we have inside, can be pointing in the direction of Qibla. Or having your back to Qibla. One or the other, right? So as long as you don't perform either one of those actions, you're fine. That's it. That's an example of something that involves personal hygiene, personal involvement, but Islam has something to say about it. Now when we talk about these three categories, right? This category is exempt from Islamic law. Why is it exempt from Islamic law? Anyone want to take a guess?
It's like your own belief.
It's your own belief. Fair enough. Let me elaborate on that. In these two, you have the ability to go to a jurist or someone who's a specialist in the field of Islam and ask him questions and follow his direction about how you should perform your actions or how you need to take care of certain responsibilities that you may have in your day-to-day life. In this category, you don't have that ability. You don't have the ability to accept the opinion of another person with regards to your philosophy of your faith. Okay? So we're not going to talk about philosophy right now. But if we get a chance, we'll come back to philosophy and we'll have a deep dive discussion, a detailed discussion on how we come to philosophy. Unless you guys want to switch and you guys want to do philosophy instead of law.
I have a question then.
Yeah.
If you don't follow a person's belief, how do you convert somebody?
If you don't follow a person's belief, how do you convert somebody?
And how would you convert somebody if you can't believe their opinions?
Okay, how would you convert somebody if you can't influence their opinions? I didn't say you can't influence, you can't accept as your own. So for example, when you're a child, right, your parents tell you, Beta, aap Muslim ho. Son, you're a Muslim. You say, okay, I'm a Muslim. What does that mean? And you slowly learn about it. At one point in time, you have to come to the logical conclusion and accept on your own that yes, I am a Muslim because it makes sense to me for the following reasons. Right? That's your philosophy. As a child, we train a child in this aspect of philosophy so that they learn when they become mature, they have the resources and tools available to make an intelligent decision about how they want to live their life. Yes? In terms of people who are outside and who don't have this philosophy imprinted on them as children, if that's your question, how do we bring them to Islam? You don't bring someone to Islam who's not looking for Islam. When someone's looking for Islam, if you're a good example, a good representative of your faith, and they ask you questions, and then you can facilitate that process for them. But you don't go up to, Joe Schmo on the street and say, "Hey Joe, come on, let's go make you a Muslim." It doesn't work that way. That's not what we do. That's not how faith works. Make sense? Now, we're going to talk about, so we're sticking to fiqh, we're sticking to Islamic laws, or are we going back to philosophy?
If no one else minds, I mean, unless you guys would prefer fiqh, could we talk about philosophy?
Okay, one for philosophy. You want to do philosophy? You guys want to do philosophy? Okay, good. Alright, so we'll do philosophy more thoroughly. We'll start next week because I prepared for fiqh, so we're going to talk about fiqh. Okay? Now, you're on board? We're just going to go over the general. We're not going to get into the weeds today then. Alright, so when we talk about fiqh, and we talk about this concept of Islamic jurisprudence, we talk about our day-to-day interactions and we talk about worship, right? Now, you have three options when it comes to worship, when it comes to these two areas. You can, one, know all the rules. And exactly what God wants from you. We'll say Allah since we're all Muslim here. You can too follow an expert. To fulfill your obligation to Allah. Or three, you can act on precaution. To ensure your actions meet the requirements. Okay? Now, what are we saying here? We're saying either one, know exactly what Allah wants from you. And there are some things that we know this, right? Because in the Quran, Allah has made no secrets about waqimus salah, pray. He said the Muslimin are people who pray. So we know, okay, prayer is mandatory for us. Well, He said in the Quran, fast. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. So Allah says, oh, those of you who believe, I have made fasting mandatory upon you the way I made it mandatory upon those before you, so that you can attain taqwa. So we know exactly what Allah wants. Some items fit into that category. We can say, yes, I know exactly what Allah is looking for. But now let's go back to the next step. In certain things we don't know. For example, Allah said pray. He said pray. Did He explain the details and the nuances of prayer? Is there anywhere where He says in your first rakat you are adamantly required to pray 2 surahs consecutively, whether that second surah is complete, incomplete, can be a verse, not a verse? Is that in the Quran? No. We have to determine from other sources what is our expectation, what is the requirement. Now when it comes to that, I have 2 options. I can either, or third option, or fourth option we can add in here. I can either follow someone who went and did the research and said, hey look, here's my proof, this is what God wants from you. And if you follow, and this is very important, if you follow these guidelines I've published for you to bring you to what God wants from you, I will take the responsibility if your actions are wrong on the Day of Judgment. You follow? When someone makes that kind of a claim, then it's like, okay, I'll follow that guy. And then the next aspect is, perform precautions. Meaning if you're not sure, you would perform the action over and over again until you've hit all the various variables. So for example, where this comes in play, where we talk about fiqh, let's say you go to pray. When you start your prayer, you say Allahu Akbar, and you recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and you recite your first surah. Surah Fatiha, complete, done. Now it comes time for the second surah. and you recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and you're not sure which surah you're going to recite. Part of you thinks I'm going to recite Surah Ikhlas. What Surah Ikhlas? Very good. Okay, just making sure. Just double check. Another part of you says, I'm going to recite Surah Nas. Another says Surah Nas. Now you've recited this Bismillah, and you haven't followed it up yet with a surah. Now, all of a sudden, after you finish, you stand there for about 5 seconds. You decide, okay, fine, I'm going to go with Surah Nas. I like Surah Nas. Today's Surah Nas day. Now tell me something. That Bismillah that you recited, is it a part of Surah Nas? Because if it's a part of Surah Nas, then you have to recite it again. Because prior to this, you hadn't recited it. Or is that Bismillah something general that applies to any surah and is independent of the surah? It's a precursor. It's a mandatory precaution that you have to perform before you perform the surah. The same way we do wudu. Wudu is not part of prayer, but it's something you have to perform. What is it? Huh? The second one? Well, no, maybe I make the argument that if Allah put it in front of all the surahs except Surah At-Tawbah, that it's a part of the surah. Now, see, this is one example of where it becomes important to understand what your requirements are. Let's say another example is you're traveling and you travel for a period of 7 days, and then you're not sure if you're going to stay for 10 days, or the 10th day, if you're staying or you're not staying, do you pray full or do you pray half? Or another example, you leave your house and you travel exactly 14 miles from your door. Are you qasr? Or are you not qasr? Meaning, do you shorten your prayers or do you not shorten your prayers? Some of the mujtahideen and some of these religious scholars have come to the conclusion that the second you leave your door, your meter starts and you go 14 miles. Others have said no. In the case of Bismillah, the same thing Sayyid Khoury used to say, that Bismillah is part of the surah. So if you say Bismillah and you don't know the surah you're going to recite after it, you have to re-recite Bismillah and pair it with the surah that you're reciting with the intention that it's a part of the surah. Sayyid Sistani holds a different opinion. Sayyid Sistani says, no, Bismillah is independent. As long as you read Bismillah, you can follow it up with any surah. We're getting into very, very detailed, specific areas of fiqh. But the idea is that there's a reason that we need to have someone who can go and do the research and come back to us with the conclusions of what it is that Allah wants from us. Because while some things are obvious, and they're obvious because all of the Muslims do them, other things are not so obvious. For example, prayer with your hands folded or open. We see a large number of Muslims who pray with their hands folded, and a good portion of Muslims who pray with their hands open. What does Allah demand of you? If I pray with my hands open, is my prayer accepted? If I pray with my hands folded, is my prayer accepted? If it's accepted in both instances, do whatever you want. But if it's not, it becomes critical for you to understand or have someone who brings the research to you and comes to the conclusion that this is permissible for you to do and this is not permissible for you to do. This is the purpose of having marja'iyyat al-mujtahideen between us and Allah. Now, this mujtahid is a concept that we see established after the ghaybat of Imam Zaman. Prior to the disappearance of Imam Zaman, we saw that we had access to the A'immah. We could go to the Imam whenever we wanted. We could write him a letter and get an answer to whichever question that we had. In the absence of the Imam, we find that we don't have this ability. So what we do is we select individuals or individuals within our community, take this responsibility upon themselves to be the jurists and come to these conclusions. To be a jurist is known as something that's called wajib-e-kifaya. Anybody know what that means without calling out? Wajib-kifaya.
If one person does it, the other people don't have to do it.
If one person does it, the other people don't have to do it. Alright? I see test question written on this, so. Kifai. We'll go kifai, like that. Hussein, you know the other half? What's the other half of the rule? If one person does it,
the,
nobody else has to.
yeah, and
If nobody does it,
everybody goes to.
everybody gets punishment for it. So we say,
It's one multiple.
if one person does it, it's kafi, sufficient, kifaya. No one else has to do it. But if nobody does it, everybody gets punished. Who knows of one other example of wajib kifaya? Mazid Naza, very good. Or ghusl al-mayyit, to wash a dead body of a Muslim. It's mandatory on everybody unless if somebody performs it, then it's off of everybody's shoulders. Very good. So, this ijtihad, this struggling, this striving in the way of knowledge and determining what does Allah demand of you is something that's called wajib kifaya. If you have one person in the whole world who does it, sufficient. You don't need anybody else to do it. What we find in our contemporary times, though, is that there are a number of people who are performing this action. Not a lot comparative to the total population. But maybe let's say there's 20 people who have this ability in the world right now to perform this action. Which one do we follow? How do you make a decision between these 20 people who are sitting there and giving you guidance that I should do this person's taqleed, or I should follow or emulate? Taqleed, by the way, is emulate. Emulate. I should emulate the actions of this scholar or that scholar or this scholar. What?
You look at their ideas, and if they're like close to yours, you like you follow them.
Interesting. You look at their ideas, and if they're close to yours, you follow them. But what if my ideology is that pork should be halal? I live in America. Pork is a very cheap form of meat. It's available everywhere, and everyone here is eating it. Or let's say another example. I live in America. In my opinion, vodka should be okay.
Yeah.
It's not made of wine. Wine is specifically forbidden. It's not made of barley. Barley is very specifically forbidden. Why can't I have vodka?
No.
It's like, I'm just giving you an example. If I can find somebody who gives that opinion,
Right side पे तीसरा चौथा मुकाम है.
I should follow him, no?
But there's nobody in here.
Maybe there is. Maybe there's differences. Maybe there is somebody out there who gave this opinion at some point in time. How do we make the distinction? And then, right, what if for me that means that I have to wear leather socks? I like that opinion. So I'm going to find a guy who says go wear leather socks. And you like a guy who says wear shorts. You're going to wear shorts. Does that make sense? Does that bring us closer to what Allah is demanding of us? Right? Our functionality here, right? Let's go back to what our functionality here was of doing this taqleed, was to find the action that Allah is demanding of us to fulfill it so that we can fulfill our obligations to Allah without having to do the research ourselves. So how do you pick a jurist? How do you pick Muslim?
Ratings.
Readings? Elaborate.
Check who has the most knowledge.
Check who has the most knowledge. Okay.
Would you have to do your own research of different tafsir of various people?
Do your own research of their tafsir or of their explanations and then come to the conclusion. Okay. Where they live. Interesting. So a guy in Las Vegas shouldn't be your mazhab is what you're telling me. Might be very true. Might be, but you never know where the world is going. Let me put it to you this way, right? The way you determine who is, first off, right, there's two things we have to determine. We have to determine who is qualified.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Right? And if we know who is qualified, and we have multiple people who are qualified,
Oh, dice.
who do we follow?
I remember now.
Okay. Let's hear your level of genius.
Someone has to recommend it to you.
Someone has to recommend it to you. Ronald McDonald has a recommendation.
No, like a follower.
A follower.
Like,
No, okay. Let me bring you there. Let me give you the shortcut, okay? One, there are certain guidelines in principle and character of who is eligible to be qualified in terms of justice, in terms of scholarship, in terms of legitimacy of birth, in terms of being an adult, being a male, and we can make that list. But again, we're not going down the fiqh path. We're going to go back to philosophy next week, so that's why we're going to bring it back to what's relevant. Let's just say, for example, there's 8 people out there in the world right now that everybody says this guy is a mujtahid, this guy is a marja, and this is somebody who's taqleed you can do, right? Let's just say, for example, we take that as a given. Who do we follow? Right? Now, let's look at our philosophy, what our functionality here is. Our functionality is to get closer to what Allah demands of us, and to be able to differentiate between these 8 individuals. Now, you and I as laymen, we don't have the resources or the information or the Arabic language for that matter to go back and do our own research and determine if this person's conclusion is correct or incorrect. What we do then is we rely on people who are experts in the industry to vouch for and tell us that this person is the most learned of all the other individuals and has the most information and comes to the best conclusions. Right? So when we have multiple people, we go back to one. Ahl al-khibra. Ahl al-khibra in English would be industry experts. Industry experts, we would look at criteria for industry experts. 1, live, work, deal with these jurists. 2, these industry experts know how to tell the difference in knowledge. So, these industry experts either live with these individuals, they deal with them, they work with them, they see them, they study with them, so they can tell the difference between the categories of each. The second would be, they would know the difference in knowledge. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, let's say for example, you're a web designer, right? Or you write computer programs. If you write a computer program, the only person who can tell you did you write a good computer program or a bad computer program is another computer programmer, right? I can make a web page and it works just like Google, right? Works just like Google. But what a computer programmer will do is he'll open it up and say, let me see the code. Let me see how you programmed it. Let me see, did you make a nice program? Did you make a neat program? Does it logically make sense? Will it always give me the right answer? Or will it sometimes give me the right answer and sometimes it'll give me garbage? A specialist who is also a computer program can judge your computer program. The same way a jurist can see when a marja comes to a conclusion, what is the basis that he came to that conclusion on? Where is his proof that this is the right answer, that this is what Allah is asking you to do? Yes? So this is why we go to the other jurists in the area and we say, hey, is this person knowledgeable? Is this person the most knowledgeable? Does this person qualify? Let's say we say yes. So we go to, and then in our case, right, we don't have people who live with Sayyid Sistani here, do we? No, we don't. So we go to the next qualified individual we have, which is the area scholar, who then goes back and does his research and provides us those resources, so we have a chain to go through, right? Then what we do is, we look at all these various aspects and we say, let's say we come back to 4 people. We have 4 people who we have jurists verified, everybody's agreed, these people are the most intelligent. Which one do we pick? All of them? You pick the most knowledgeable based on the information that you have available to you, right? So you pick the most knowledgeable individual amongst these 4 and that's the taqleed that you do. Now, in modern times, what we've come to is that people have come to the conclusion that I have the ability to pick a marja based on what's convenient for my lifestyle. Is this true or false? I mean, people are doing it, but is it the right thing to do?
No.
Why not?
Because you're doing it for your own good.
You're doing it for your own good.
Like, you're choosing the one that goes with your views.
But brother, I mean, you know, God created Islam. He wanted Islam to be available to the people. This guy's giving me a modern interpretation. He knows the type of life I'm living in the West. These other Maraja, they don't understand the lifestyle in the West. They don't know what my difficulties are, my problems are. So why can't I pick that one? Can I pick that one? No? Why not? You don't know why. Okay? Let me give you another example here. There are certain Maraja out there that say that industrial alcohol is najis. Now industrial alcohol, let me give you an example. That wall you're leaning on has industrial alcohol in it. This carpet you're sitting on has industrial alcohol in it. Maybe he is the most. Maybe, you know, do I not pick a marja on this basis? Because it would be impossible for me to live in today's society? Yes or no? Is that relevant? Really, my argument to you and my point to you is that it's not relevant. Your job is to find the most intelligent individual who is proven by Ahlul Khibra and follow him for what his rulings are, regardless of how convenient or inconvenient they are. Now, what will happen sometimes is that you'll come to a point in time where you cannot find any difference between the intellectual capacity of two individuals in common society. When you come to that point that there's no difference and you can't find any difference and no one's disagreeing that these two people are incredibly smart, then you can pick. You can pick either one. But until that time, you'll find many individuals who are contested in their authority and ability to derive law. You should not do their taqlid. Why? Because they're not bringing you to the point that you need to be at to be able to answer the responsibilities that Allah has placed them. Does that make sense? Any questions? We went through a very, very philosophical conversation here in terms of how you get to this point of doing taqlid. And then in taqlid we would talk about what are the conditions on a muqallid, what are the conditions on a mujtahid. And we can talk about, for example, let's say, for example, I don't do taqlid. Let's say I don't do taqlid and I just perform an action willy-nilly. Well, willy-nilly is a very modern term. Let's say I perform my actions without taking into consideration what Allah has demanded of me. Are they accepted?
No.
No. Why not?
You have to follow a Muslim.
But Allah said pray, I prayed.
They can be another one.
See, these are very interesting questions and we can get to them in detail, and I want you guys to think about these things and bring back questions on them. Because it's relevant to you. If you're expected to follow an individual, you should understand what that involves. What are the specifics? What does it mean? So for example, a marja has the ability to say that if you performed 10 years of a'mal without doing taqlid of an individual, a marja has the ability to say that those a'mal are accepted or those a'mal are not accepted. Because what is he doing? He's saying, I will take responsibility for those actions for you on the Day of Judgment, that you perform them correctly. Hence, this becomes relevant. Otherwise, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but then you're responsible if Allah accepts those actions or doesn't accept those actions. You have to deal with the consequences. This is putting someone, an intermediary who's an expert in faith, between you and Allah on the Day of Judgment. The same way we would want, on the Day of Judgment, the Ahlul Bayt to be our intermediaries because we follow their actions. Any questions? Okay, so next week we'll start our conversation around philosophy of Islam. And you'll probably get one or two questions from here. I know it was a little boring for you guys this week. But, huh? Do you want a test? Next week we have a test on the ayat of Tahara that we did, and we'll go through it. And next week what we'll do is we'll start principles of faith, and we'll talk about how Tawheed relates to atheism and proving the existence of Allah from intellectual purposes and all that fun stuff. No questions? Yes?
Are there very specific guidelines for determining a proper marja?
Very specific guidelines for determining a proper marja. The guidelines would be, first off, again, male, adult, adil, just, the most knowledgeable. These are a few of them. There's one or two more after that, actually. But these are characteristics. Then a number of individuals can fit those characteristics. Then the next step is that this person is vetted to have the capacity or the intellectual position to be called a mujtahid, right? So the way Islamic sciences, so if I was to talk you through this, right, what I would say is when you want to study Islamic sciences, you go to the university. You study, you study, you study, and there are degrees. When you get to the degree of Ba'th al-Kharij, are basically where it's now you're formulating your ability to create an Islamic law. Right? What is an Islamic law? Is created on the basis of Quran and Hadith. A mujtahid's job is to find the interface where these two fit together, and what is the expectation of you based on what Quran says and what Hadith says, and putting the two together and giving you the answer. To say that based on what this Quranic ayat says and what these Hadith tell us, you are obligated to perform X, Y, and Z action in X, Y, and Z condition. Yes? And when a scholar starts studying this, his teacher comes to the conclusion that at some point in time that this individual has now developed the ability to perform this analysis on his own and come to a conclusion about what's required. Now, you can become qualified to perform these rulings and these answers in subjects areas. So for example, you could be a mujtahid in wudu. You could be a mujtahid in salat, a mujtahid in business dealings. All these various aspects you can become in determining najasat, in determining taharat. You can become, and in levels. So as you study, you become an expert in these. When you become an expert in these, you're now a mujtahid. Now from amongst the mujtahideen, what's selected is the most knowledgeable mujtahid to become the marja. Alright? So now amongst all of these, what happens is that there are boards or there are agreements to say that this is the most knowledgeable amongst all of us. And that individual then becomes marja of his time. So for example, in the case of Sheikh Al-Ansari, who was a mujtahid of his time and wrote books that are still studied today in the Hawza, almost 700-800 years ago, when his teacher passed away, they came to him and they said, listen, of all the available scholars, you're the most knowledgeable, you become the marja, everybody will follow your actions and emulate your opinion. He said, no, I refuse. He says, when I was younger, there was this Sayyid who I used to study with, and he was more smarter than I am, so go make him the mujtahid. He didn't want it. He says, I don't want to be the mujtahid. I don't want to be the one that everybody emulates. So they went to his contemporary who lived in Hilla. Sheikh Al-Ansari lived in Najaf. They went to his contemporary who lived in Hilla. When they went to Hilla and they said, hey listen, you know, our marja a'lama of the time has passed, we have no mujtahid, we need someone to emulate, someone opinions to follow, and when the Muslims have a question, they need someone to go to. We want you to be that person. He said, well, what about Sheikh Al-Ansari? They said, well, Sheikh Al-Ansari, he said, you used to study with him and you're smarter than he is. So he says, you should take this responsibility, not him. The Sayyid replied, he said, yes, when I used to study with Ansari, I was smarter than him and I studied more than him. But he says, I left studies 30 years ago. Ansari lives in Najaf and still teaches and is still a student. So therefore, he's more qualified. When this news came back to Sheikh Al-Ansari says, I refuse to accept the mantle of mujtahid or marja unless if Imam al-Zaman himself appoints me this position. And he refused. So the people became really frustrated. They didn't have an answer. They didn't know what's going on. They didn't know what to do now because this person who should take this responsibility on his head and guide all the people, this person who should be the point person that all the Muslimin can ask their questions to and get a definitive answer on, is refusing to accept this mantle of responsibility. And they argued with him a bit, and he didn't give an answer. One day he was teaching his class. And he's teaching his class in the front and all the students are gathered around him. And from the back somebody stands up and says, oh Sheikh, I have a question for you. Sheikh says, ask. So this person says, let's say there's a woman and she's married to a man and Allah sends His punishment on this man and turns this man into a dog. What is the condition of that woman? Is she divorced? And if she's divorced, what type of iddah should she observe? What happens to this woman? Right? Because a minute ago she was married, now is she married to a dog? What's the ruling? So Sheikh Al-Ansari, who's sitting in his class and teaching, he turns and he says, that's a very interesting question. The answer to that question would be depending on, was that dog alive or a statue? And he continues, he says, if Allah turned that man into the statue of a dog, he's dead. So the woman is divorced or she's a widow. And she observes the iddah of a widow. He says, however, if Allah turned that man into a living dog, man's still alive, but she can't be married to a dog, so she's divorced. And she observes the iddah, or the separation time period, of a divorced woman. He says, but your question in general is moot. Because since the coming of Rahmatul lil Alameen, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah has promised that He will not send down His punishment on people until the Day of Judgment. So to that end, that couldn't happen. So this person who asked the question, he says, truly you are the mujtahid. Truly you are the marja. Says it 3 times and leaves. Now Shaykh al-Ansari sits for a second. And he turns to his students and he says, geniuses, do you know who that was? They say, no, who was it? He says, that was Imam Zaman, that was the Imam of our time, go catch him. So they go running out to go see him. Where did he go? And ask him more questions and be with him, and he disappeared. And immediately Shaykh al-Ansari knew that this is his responsibility now to become the marja at the time, and to take the responsibility for all the mu'mineen around the world and be the source of answers and information for them. Does that make sense? So, where did we start from? What was the question again?
Are there specific guidelines to follow in picking?
Guidelines. Does that answer your question a little bit? Interesting story, right? But the guidelines in general are is that once someone meets these qualifications, they have to be deemed by the scholars within the area to be the most knowledgeable. If there are people who deem this individual to be the most knowledgeable of all the scholars available, he is eligible for emulation. What he publishes is known as all of his rulings. And relating to these 2 areas that we talked about, worship and day-to-day dealings. And he has to publish along all those guidelines and present all that information on those basis so that people have resources available to them. And then he makes himself available to answer questions and he becomes the point person for the ummah in total.
What if, like, the mujtahid doesn't sin?
What if? One of the conditions for being a mujtahid is to be an adl person, right? Be a just person. That means that this person doesn't sin. If, for example, adalat is such a beautiful thing that as soon as you make one sin or you make one mistake, you lose all of it. You're no longer just. However, as soon as you ask for forgiveness, it comes right back. So the person who, for example, sins and then never asked for forgiveness for his sin, or never acknowledges that he sins, can no longer be a mujtahid, can no longer be a majid. Okay. Any other questions? No? All right. Sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Ya Hadi! Ya Hadi!